Today for Queer History Month, because every month is Queer History Month, the story about Peter Wells, which turns out to be a mystery that illuminates the persecution of queer people in the UK that is absolutely heartbreaking and important. I learned about this book because I went up to Amsterdam for Pride to read from my book, which is a graphic novel about the rise of medical marijuana in California through the crucible of the AIDS crisis, led by the heroic queers and their allies. And the talk went really well, and I met the organizer's partner, whose name was Merrick Badger. And so Merrick Badger heard this story about Peter Wells because in the first great gay song, Glad to Be Gay by Tom Robinson, this came out in the mid-70s, and it wasn't a happy gay song, it was an incredibly powerful protest song. And apparently the lyrics changed over the decades as the issues of the queer community shifted. But in one of the earliest versions, there is an entire stanza about Peter Wells. And so Merrick Badger tried to track down who that was and why they were important. And it turns out that he had accidentally stumbled upon the person who secretly changed the entire world in the UK. So the background is that in Peter Wells' time, it was in 1967 that the laws decriminalized homosexuality. So 2 men over 21 could have sex, even anal sex, though anal sex was illegal for everyone else because, Britain. But everything else was still gross indecency. Men were being convicted of it by the thousands. Far from the new legislation heralding an age of tolerance, in the 5 years after 1967, convictions for gross indecency actually rose by 160%. Men were usually fined around 20 pounds, which is 200 to 300 pounds in today's money. Queer bashers who beat gay men were fined about the same amount. So, a public gay kiss or a tooth-cracking headbutt to a stranger's face were equal crimes in society's eyes. But worse than gross indecency were the penalties for sex with underage men. Here's the kicker. Straight sex was legal with 16-year-olds, but gay men had to be 21. Thousands of men were convicted of consensual sex with men under 21, which was usually punished with imprisonment. Peter Wells was 26, his boyfriend was 18. The discrepancy of ages was enough to get him sentenced to 2.5 years in jail. There, his queer offenses made him the target of beatings, rapes, and other assaults from guards and inmates alike. So even though it took Merrick Badger months of work, years of work, to track down who Peter Wells was and what his story was, he uncovered something even greater. It turns out that Peter Wells, who, though he had a lifetime of tragedy behind him, he lost 2 sets of parents while he was young and had to go through the horrendous orphanage system of the UK, which was, almost torture. He did come from money, and he had money in a trust, and he used some of that money from his case to launch an anonymous challenge at the European Court of Human Rights, challenging the British government's age of consent discrimination against gay men. And so, even though because of tragedy he wouldn't live to see the result, because he got that ball rolling, eventually in the highest court in the land, they said that this is discrimination against gay men, that this can no longer happen. And so the age of consent discrepancies that was sending so many gay men to prison were finally abolished decades later because Peter Wells got it started. Nobody knew that he was the guy until Merrick Badger uncovered it. But now you know too. You can find out more online, and that's a little bit of how one persecuted gay person stood up for their rights, and eventually, things change in a really big way, leading to the openness that we get to experience today that we so obviously have to keep fighting for. Oh, and one final tidbit. This book, there's an audiobook version by Tom Robinson, the writer of that incredible gay anthem. So either listen to this book or go listen to Glad to Be Gay and get inspired.